Hello, friend. Welcome to tonight's gentle journey together. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this quiet time with me as we settle into rest. Whether you're ending a long day, seeking comfort in the darkness, or simply looking for a peaceful story to carry you towards sleep, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we journey not to a distant land, but to a time when courage wore the face of quiet grace. When a young woman's gentle strength would reshape the fate of an entire people. You and I are about to meet Esther, though that wasn't always her name. We'll walk beside her through marble corridors where every step was watched, every word weighed. We'll sit quietly in her chambers as she faced choices that would echo through generations. This isn't a story of swords or battles, but of something far more profound. The kind of courage that grows in silence, that blooms in uncertainty, and that changes the world one careful decision at a time. As we begin, imagine the scent of Persian roses drifting through latticed windows, the soft rustle of silk against stone floors, and the gentle wisdom of an older cousin who saw in a frightened girl the seeds of a queen. Tonight, we'll discover together that sometimes the most extraordinary thing you can do is simply remain present when everything in you wants to flee. And sometimes the most radical act is choosing love over fear, even when you can't see the outcome. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders soften, and prepare to witness how one woman's quiet faith became a beacon of hope for countless generations. Esther's story is waiting for us, patient as starlight, gentle as morning rain. In the ancient city of Susa, where the morning sun painted clay walls the colour of honey, there lived a girl whose Hebrew name meant myrtle, Hadassah. Picture her, if you will, in the early hours when the city was just stirring to life. The air would carry the scent of fresh bread from nearby ovens, the distant sound of merchants preparing their wares, and always the gentle murmur of prayers drifting from the Jewish quarter where she made her home. Hadassah had known loss early, as so many children do. Her parents had died when she was small, too young to fully understand why they wouldn't return, but old enough to feel the empty spaces they left behind. Yet in the way that grace sometimes works, she found herself in the tender care of her cousin Mordecai, a man whose name meant little man, though there was nothing small about his love for this orphaned child. Mordecai's house was modest, built of sun-dried brick with a small courtyard where a pomegranate tree offered shade in the afternoons. It wasn't grand by Persian standards, but it was home, filled with the quiet rhythms that had sustained their people through decades of exile. Each morning, Hadassah would wake to the sound of Mordecai's gentle voice reciting the Shema, the ancient prayer that reminded them who they were, even so far from Jerusalem. She was a beautiful child, though she carried that beauty lightly, without vanity or awareness of how others might see her. Her dark hair caught sunlight like polished wood, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to understand more than her years should allow. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that set her apart. There was something in her spirit, a quiet strength that drew people to her, a wisdom that seemed to bloom naturally in her heart. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and the air had cooled, Mordecai would sit with Hadassah in their small courtyard. He would tell her stories of their ancestors, of Abraham's faith and Sarah's laughter, of Moses leading their people through the wilderness, of David's psalms echoing in the hills of Judah. These weren't just tales to pass the time. They were her inheritance, threads connecting her to a tapestry much larger than their modest life in Susa. "Remember, little myrtle," Mordecai would say, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "We are here for a reason. The Almighty has not forgotten us, even in this foreign land." And Hadassah would nod, storing these words in her heart like precious seeds, not yet knowing how they would one day bloom into the courage that would save a nation. Life in the Jewish quarter had its own gentle rhythm. There were feast days to celebrate, when neighbours would gather and the air would fill with laughter and the aroma of special foods prepared with careful tradition. There were times of mourning too, when the community would come together to remember their lost homeland, to weep for the temple that was no more, and to hold each other through the particular sadness of exile. Hadassah learned to move through both joy and sorrow with equal grace. She helped other families when they needed it, bringing soup to the sick, playing with the youngest children, and always listening. She had a gift for listening, this young girl, as if she understood that sometimes the most important thing you can offer another person is simply your presence, your willingness to hear their heart. The Persian Empire was vast and complex, a tapestry of peoples and languages and customs. In Susa, you might hear Aramaic in the morning, Persian in the afternoon, and a dozen other tongues echoing through the marketplace. For the Jewish community, this diversity was both a blessing and a challenge. They could practice their faith, yes, but quietly, carefully, always aware that they were strangers in a strange land. Mordecai worked in the king's gate, a position that required wisdom and discretion. He was trusted by the Persian officials, respected for his honesty and steady character, but he was also careful never to forget who he was. Careful to teach Hadassah that they could be grateful for Persian protection while still holding their own identity sacred. As Hadassah grew from child to young woman, those around her began to notice something special about her. She had a way of bringing peace to difficult situations, of seeing good in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. She was kind without being naive, gentle without being weak. In her, the best of her people's wisdom seemed to shine forth naturally, like light through clear water, and perhaps most importantly, she learned to trust in things she couldn't see, to believe that even in uncertainty, even in exile, even in the ordinary moments of daily life, there was purpose and meaning and love greater than anything she could imagine. She didn't know, in those quiet days in Mordecai's house, that she was being prepared for something extraordinary. She simply lived each day with grace, with faithfulness, with the quiet courage that would one day change the world. The myrtle tree, her namesake, is known for its resilience, for its ability to flourish even in difficult soil. And like the myrtle, young Hadassah was growing strong roots, deep roots that would one day hold firm when the storms of history came calling. For now, she was simply a girl learning to trust, learning to love, learning to listen to the gentle voice of faith that whispered, even in exile, even in uncertainty, you are not forgotten. While young Hadassah grew in wisdom and grace in the modest streets of Susa, far above her humble neighborhood, the great palace of King Xerxes rose like a mountain of marble and gold. Picture it, if you can, this wonder of the ancient world, where every surface seemed to shimmer with precious stones, where the very air carried the scent of frankincense and myrrh, and where power lived and breathed in chambers so vast that a whisper could echo for what seemed like eternity. The palace was more than a home. It was a statement written in stone and precious metal, a declaration to all the world that the Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing lands and peoples beyond counting. Every pillar told a story of conquest. Every golden frieze spoke of tribute flowing in from distant provinces. Every courtyard whispered of the absolute authority that rested in the hands of one man, Xerxes, the king of kings. To walk through the palace gates was to enter another world entirely, a world where common concerns seemed to vanish in the face of such overwhelming grandeur. The walls rose high above your head, covered in glazed tiles that caught and reflected light in patterns that seemed almost alive. Bulls and lions, symbols of strength and majesty, marched in endless processions across these walls, their eyes seeming to follow visitors as they passed in awed silence. The throne room itself defied description, though we must try to imagine it together. Imagine pillars that stretched up until they seemed to touch the very heavens, each one carved from a single piece of stone and polished until it gleamed like black water. Between these pillars, tapestries hung like captured rainbows, woven by the finest craftsmen from across the empire, depicting scenes of triumph and glory that made mortal viewers feel very small indeed. And there, at the heart of it all, sat the golden throne, a masterpiece of metalwork that caught every ray of sunlight and threw it back in brilliant cascades. When King Xerxes sat upon that throne, draped in robes of purple and gold, wearing the crown that had been worn by Cyrus the Great himself, he seemed less like a man and more like a force of nature, beautiful, terrible, and utterly beyond the reach of ordinary humanity. Yet for all its splendour, the palace was also a place of careful protocol, of unspoken rules, of traditions so ancient that no one remembered their origins. Every gesture had meaning, every word was weighed, every glance could carry consequences that might ripple through the empire. To live in the palace was to live in a world where survival depended not just on beauty or intelligence, but on understanding the delicate dance of power that played out in its corridors every single day. Queen Vashti had learned this dance well, or so everyone thought. She had been the perfect Persian queen, elegant, graceful, beautiful beyond measure. Her quarters in the palace were like a garden made of silk and gold, where she held court, surrounded by the most accomplished women of the empire. Musicians played softly in her presence, poets recited verses in her honour, and artists painted her portrait on ivory and precious wood. But on one particular evening, when wine flowed freely and the king's heart was merry with celebration, Queen Vashti would make a choice that would change everything. The king had commanded her to appear before his guests, to display her beauty like a precious jewel for all to admire. And she, in a moment that must have felt both terrifying and liberating, said no. The word hung in the perfumed air of the palace like a thunderclap. No one, absolutely no one, said no to King Xerxes. The very walls seemed to hold their breath as the implications of her refusal rippled outward. Here was a queen, secure in her position, beloved of the king, suddenly revealed to be as vulnerable as any other mortal in the empire. The king's advisers whispered urgently among themselves. What if word of this defiance spread? What if other wives throughout the empire began to think they too could refuse their husbands' commands? The very foundation of Persian society, built on order and hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, seemed to tremble in the wake of one woman's quiet rebellion. And so, with the inexorable logic of absolute power, Queen Vashti was banished, stripped of her crown, exiled from the palace, erased from the official records as if she had never existed at all. Her beautiful chambers stood empty, her servants were dismissed, and her name became a whisper that prudent people learned not to speak. But nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. The palace without a queen was like a garden without flowers, magnificent perhaps, but somehow incomplete. And so the search would begin, the search that would reach into every corner of the empire, that would touch the lives of countless young women, that would eventually find its way to a modest house in the Jewish quarter, where a girl named Hadassah lived quietly with her cousin Mordecai, never dreaming that destiny was about to knock upon her door. The great palace waited, patient as stone, beautiful as morning, powerful as the sunrise that painted its walls each day with gold. Soon, very soon, it would have a new queen, and though none could know it then, not the king in his golden throne room, not the advisers whispering in shadowed corridors, not even Mordecai praying in his simple courtyard, this new queen would bring with her a courage that would transform the very meaning of power itself. The palace without Queen Vashti felt like a symphony missing its melody. Beautiful still, but somehow hollow, incomplete. King Xerxes walked through chambers that had once echoed with her laughter, past gardens where she had once moved like poetry in motion, and the emptiness seemed to follow him like a shadow he couldn't escape. His advisers watched their king with careful eyes, noting how the light seemed dimmed in the great throne room, how even the most elaborate feasts felt subdued without a queen's gracious presence. They whispered among themselves in corridors lined with precious stones, debating, planning, until finally one among them, a man named Memucan, approached the throne with a proposal that would change everything. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of one who had learned to speak carefully in the presence of absolute power. Let beautiful young women be sought throughout all the provinces of your kingdom. Let the king appoint officers in every province to gather them, that you might choose from among them a new queen, one who will bring honor to your throne and joy to your heart. The decree went forth like ripples on still water, spreading outward from the golden halls of Susa to the farthest reaches of the empire, from the mountains of Media to the valleys of Mesopotamia, from the deserts of Arabia to the fertile plains of Egypt. The message travelled with the swift efficiency that marked all Persian administration. Beautiful young women of marriageable age were to be brought to the palace, to be prepared, to be presented, and from among them the king would choose his bride. Imagine the mixture of excitement and terror that must have swept through households across the empire. For some families, this represented the ultimate dream, the possibility that their daughter might become queen of the greatest empire the world had ever known. For others, it felt like a sentence, knowing that their beloved child would be taken from them, perhaps forever, to enter a world of luxury and danger in equal measure. In the Jewish quarter of Susa, the news arrived like a spring storm, sudden and overwhelming. Mordecai heard it first in the king's gate, where he worked among the other officials, and the weight of understanding settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Beautiful young women were to be gathered, and Hadassah, his precious Hadassah, was undeniably beautiful. He walked home slowly that evening, his footsteps heavy on the familiar stones, rehearsing in his mind how he might tell her. The pomegranate tree in their courtyard was blooming, its red flowers bright against the deepening sky. And for a moment he allowed himself to imagine that nothing would change, that they could simply continue their quiet life together, safe in their small world of prayer and tradition and gentle love. But when Hadassah looked up from her weaving, when she saw the expression on his face, she knew. Perhaps it was the way his shoulders drooped, or the careful way he sat down beside her, or simply the intuition that had always connected them. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mordecai nodded, unable to trust his voice for a moment. Then, gathering his strength, he took her hands in his. "We don't know that they will choose you," he said gently, though they both knew it was likely. "But if they do, little Myrtle, remember who you are. Remember the stories I've told you, the faith that has carried our people through every trial. And remember," his voice grew softer still, "that the Almighty sees all things, knows all things, and loves you more than even I do." The king's officers came 3 days later, moving through the city with systematic efficiency, accompanied by guards and scribes who recorded every name. When they knocked on Mordecai's door, Hadassah was ready. She had spent those 3 days in prayer, in tears, in quiet preparation. She had memorized her cousin's face, the sound of his voice, the feeling of safety that his presence had always brought. She was allowed to take almost nothing, just a simple bag with a few personal items, a reminder of home in the overwhelming grandeur that awaited her. As she walked away from the only home she had ever known, she didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see Mordecai standing in the doorway, watching his little Myrtle disappear into the vast machinery of empire. But she carried with her more than the officers could see. She carried Mordecai's love, the stories of her people, the quiet strength that had been growing in her heart through all the ordinary days of her childhood. She carried faith like a small flame, fragile perhaps, but steady, and somehow she sensed that this was not an ending but a beginning, though she couldn't yet imagine what kind of story she was entering. The palace rose before them like a mountain of marble, its towers piercing the sky, its walls reflecting the afternoon sun in dazzling displays of light and colour. With each step closer, Hadassah felt herself becoming smaller, more vulnerable, more aware of how little control she had over what came next, and yet, beneath the fear, beneath the overwhelming sense of displacement, there was something else, a quiet voice that whispered, "Be strong and courageous, for your God goes with you." The women's quarters of the palace were like a world within a world, a realm of silk and silver where time moved differently, where days blended into months in a rhythm of preparation and transformation. Here, separated from the noise and bustle of the main palace, dozens of young women from across the empire began the long journey toward a single night, when one among them would be chosen as queen. Hadassah found herself assigned to the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch who supervised the women's quarters with a wisdom born of years in the palace. He was a man of middle years, with gentle eyes that seemed to see everything, and hands that moved with the precise grace of someone who had learned to navigate the dangerous currents of court life. When he first looked upon Hadassah, something in his expression shifted. A recognition, perhaps, of qualities that went deeper than mere physical beauty. "You will be called Esther here," he told her quietly on that first overwhelming day, using the Persian name that meant star. It was safer this way, he explained, to have a name that wouldn't immediately mark her as foreign, as different. And so Hadassah became Esther, wrapping this new identity around herself like a protective cloak, while keeping her true self hidden like a precious jewel in her heart. The preparation process was unlike anything she could have imagined. For 6 months, she and the other young women were bathed in oil of myrrh, a precious substance that softened the skin and filled the air with its haunting fragrance. The oil was warm, golden, and so valuable that a single jar could feed a family for months. Yet here it was used lavishly, poured over willing bodies in marble chambers where steam rose like incense and the sound of gentle music drifted through latticed windows. The myrrh did more than beautify. It transformed. Day by day, Esther could feel her skin becoming softer, more radiant, as if the very essence of the costly oil was seeping into her being. But more than that, the long months of preparation were changing her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The frightened girl who had walked through the palace gates was slowly, quietly, becoming something else. Someone else. After the 6 months of myrrh came 6 months of sweet odours and cosmetics, each preparation more elaborate than the last. There were oils infused with roses from the royal gardens, perfumes blended by master craftsmen who guarded their secrets jealously, and cosmetics made from precious minerals ground to powder fine as dust. Esther learned to move differently, to carry herself with the grace expected of those who might one day serve at the highest levels of the empire. But it wasn't only her appearance that was being refined. Haggai, recognizing something special in this quiet young woman, began to teach her the intricate protocols of palace life. How to speak in the presence of royalty, how to walk through corridors where every step was observed, how to eat at tables where every gesture carried meaning. She learned the languages of the court, the subtle differences between a bow and a curtsy, the careful art of saying much while revealing little. Through it all, Esther kept her secret. As Mordecai had instructed her, she told no one of her Jewish heritage, of the prayers she whispered in Hebrew when she was alone, of the dietary laws she followed as best she could without attracting attention. It was a delicate balance, this living between two worlds, but somehow she managed it with a grace that impressed even the other young women who shared her quarters. Haggai grew fond of her, though he was careful not to show favoritism too openly. There was something about Esther's quiet strength, her willingness to learn, her kindness to the servants and the other women. That set her apart. She never complained about the long months of preparation, never spoke harshly of the other candidates, never seemed to scheme or plot as some of the others did. Instead, she moved through each day with a peaceful dignity that drew people to her like flowers turning toward the sun. The other young women came from every corner of the empire, each bringing their own beauty, their own customs, their own dreams of what it might mean to become queen. There was Roxana from the mountains of Persia, with hair like midnight and eyes like stars. There was Lydia from the Greek cities, whose wit was as sharp as her beauty was refined. There was Shamira from the desert lands, whose voice could make grown men weep when she sang. Yet somehow, in this palace of extraordinary women, Esther found her place, not by competing, not by trying to outshine the others, but simply by being herself, by allowing her natural grace and goodness to bloom like a flower opening to the morning sun. The servants loved her because she treated them with respect. The other women trusted her because she never gossiped or betrayed confidences. And Haggai, wise in the ways of the palace, began to suspect that this quiet young woman might be the one the king was seeking, though he kept such thoughts to himself. As the months passed, Esther felt herself changing, growing, becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. Yet at her core, in the deepest part of her heart, she remained Hadassah, the myrtle, rooted in faith, sustained by love, and prepared, though she didn't yet know it, for a destiny that would require every ounce of courage she possessed. The year of preparation was drawing to a close, and with it came a tension that seemed to fill the very air of the women's quarters. Each young woman knew that soon, very soon, she would be presented to the king, and after that night, her life would be forever changed. Some would return to the women's quarters to live in comfortable obscurity, while one, just one, would emerge as the new queen of Persia. Esther felt this tension like a weight upon her heart, but she carried it differently than the others, where some of the women had grown anxious, spending sleepless nights planning what they would say, what they would wear, how they might capture the king's attention. Esther remained remarkably calm, not because she didn't understand what was at stake, but because she had learned, in the deepest part of her being, to trust in something larger than her own efforts. Haggai watched her with growing admiration. In all his years supervising the women's quarters, he had never seen anyone quite like Esther. She had a way of moving through the palace that seemed effortless, as if she belonged there not because she demanded it, but because grace itself had claimed her. When disputes arose among the women, as they inevitably did, Esther somehow found herself in the role of peacemaker, not by force or manipulation, but simply by her presence, by her ability to see the good in everyone. The palace servants, who saw everything and forgot nothing, began to whisper about the young woman called Esther, how she never asked for more than she was given, how she remembered their names and asked about their families, how she seemed genuinely interested in their lives. In a place where most of the royal women treated servants as invisible, Esther's kindness was like water in a desert, refreshing, unexpected, and deeply appreciated. Even among the other candidates, Esther had won a grudging respect. It would have been easy to resent her, this quiet young woman who seemed to effortlessly attract favour wherever she went. But there was something about her that made such resentment difficult to sustain. She celebrated others' successes genuinely, offered comfort during moments of homesickness, and never seemed to view the other women as competition to be defeated. When the time came for Esther to choose what she would wear, what jewels she would display, what gifts she might present to the king, Haggai expected her to spend days deliberating, as the others had done. Instead, she simply asked, "What do you think would be most appropriate?" Her trust in his judgment, her lack of grasping ambition, only confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that this young woman was different from all the rest. The evening of her presentation arrived like a dream wrapped in golden light. Esther had been bathed in the finest oils, dressed in silks that seemed to shimmer with their own inner fire, and adorned with jewellery that caught the lamplight and threw it back in brilliant sparkles. Yet for all her outward beauty, what struck those who saw her was something deeper, a serenity, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from within. As she walked through the corridors toward the king's chambers, her heart beat steadily in her chest, not with panic, but with a strange peace. She thought of Mordecai, probably sitting in his small courtyard at this very moment, praying for her protection. She thought of the stories he had told her of Esther's ancestors, of people who had faced impossible situations with faith as their only weapon. The great doors opened before her, and she stepped into the presence of the most powerful man in the world. King Xerxes sat upon a smaller throne than the one in his formal audience chamber, but even here, in his private quarters, the sense of absolute authority was overwhelming. The room glowed with the light of countless lamps, their flames reflecting off surfaces of gold and precious stone, creating an atmosphere that seemed almost otherworldly. But when the king's eyes met hers, something shifted in the air between them, where other women had tried to dazzle him with elaborate performances, with calculated displays of beauty and accomplishment. Esther simply stood there, present, real, unafraid. She didn't try to be anything other than who she was, and in that authenticity, she was breathtaking. They spoke quietly through the evening, and Xerxes found himself charmed not by what Esther did, but by who she was. Her responses were thoughtful without being rehearsed. Her questions showed genuine interest rather than mere flattery, and her presence brought a sense of peace to rooms that were usually filled with the tension of performance and expectation. When morning came, when the servants came to escort her back to the women's quarters, Esther carried with her the knowledge that something profound had happened, not just because the king had favoured her, though he clearly had, but because she had remained herself throughout it all. She had not compromised her values, had not betrayed her faith, had not become someone else in pursuit of a crown. The announcement came that afternoon, carried through the palace by messengers whose voices rang with excitement. Esther, the young woman who had come from relative obscurity, had been chosen as queen. The royal crown was placed upon her head, the royal robes draped about her shoulders, and suddenly, this girl who had grown up in a modest house in the Jewish quarter found herself the most powerful woman in the greatest empire the world had ever known. Yet even in her triumph, Esther remained true to the wisdom Mordecai had taught her. She knew that crowns could be taken away as easily as they were given, that true strength came not from position but from character, and that her real journey, the one that would test every fibre of her being, was only just beginning. In the months following Esther's coronation, life in the palace settled into new rhythms, like a symphony finding its harmony after a change of key. Queen Esther moved through her royal duties with the same quiet grace that had first captured the king's attention, while in the city below, Mordecai continued his work at the king's gate, carrying in his heart both joy for his cousin's elevation and the bittersweet ache of missing her daily presence. The King's Gate was more than just an entrance to the palace. It was the beating heart of Persian administration, where officials gathered to conduct the business of empire, where petitioners came seeking justice, and where the constant flow of information moved like water through carefully carved channels. Mordecai had earned his place there through years of faithful service, and though he was Jewish, his integrity and wisdom had won him respect among his Persian colleagues. It was here, in this place of careful listening and patient observation, that Mordecai's loyalty to his adopted homeland would be tested in ways he never could have anticipated. The Persian Empire, for all its grandeur and power, was not immune to the dangers that lurk in the shadows of absolute authority. Where there is a king, there are always those who would be king, and where there is power, there are always those who would seize it for themselves. On a day that began like any other, with the morning sun painting the palace walls in shades of gold and rose, Mordecai was sitting in his usual place at the gate, reviewing scrolls and conducting the quiet business that kept the empire running smoothly. The air was filled with the familiar sounds of daily life, merchants calling their wares, children playing in nearby streets, and the gentle murmur of conversation among the officials and petitioners who gathered there each day. But something was different this morning. A tension in the air that made Mordecai's practiced instincts sharpen with attention. Two men, palace guards named Bigthana and Teresh, were speaking in hushed tones near one of the great pillars, their voices carrying just far enough for someone with careful ears to catch fragments of their conversation. At first, Mordecai paid little attention, assuming it was merely the usual palace gossip that flowed like water through the corridors of power. But as he listened more carefully, the nature of their discussion became clear, and his blood ran cold. These men, trusted guardians of the king's safety, were plotting nothing less than assassination, planning to lay hands on King Xerxes himself. The weight of this knowledge settled on Mordecai's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Here was information that could save the king's life, but it also placed him in an impossibly delicate position. He was a Jew, a member of a minority people living in exile, and accusations from someone in his position might not be taken seriously. Worse, if he was wrong, if he had misunderstood, the consequences could be severe not just for him, but potentially for all the Jewish people in the empire. Yet as Mordecai sat there, weighing his options, he knew there was really no choice at all. Right was right, regardless of the personal cost. The king had been good to the Jewish people, had allowed them to practice their faith and build their communities, and more importantly, this was simply the right thing to do. Evil must be opposed, even when, especially when, opposing it required courage. But how to proceed? Mordecai couldn't simply walk into the throne room and demand an audience with the king. Such breaches of protocol could result in death, even for someone trying to save the king's life. Instead, he would have to trust in the one connection he had to the inner circles of power. His beloved Esther, now Queen Esther, though even she couldn't know his true relationship to her. Through the careful network of servants and attendants that connected the palace to the outside world, Mordecai sent word to Esther of what he had discovered. The message was necessarily brief and carefully worded, but its urgency was unmistakable. The queen's cousin, the message said, had uncovered a plot against the king's life, and this information must reach the royal ear without delay. Esther, when she received this message, felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon her heart. Even as queen, she had learned to move carefully through the dangerous currents of palace life, but this was different. This was her first real test, her first opportunity to use her position not for personal gain, but for the protection of the man who had elevated her, and by extension, for the good of the empire itself. With wisdom beyond her years, Esther chose her moment carefully, when the king was relaxed, when his attention was focused and his mood was good. She approached him with the information Mordecai had provided. She spoke carefully, giving credit to Mordecai by name, ensuring that this faithful man would receive the recognition his loyalty deserved. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The two conspirators were questioned, their guilt established beyond doubt, and justice was carried out with the efficiency that marked all Persian administration. King Xerxes' life had been saved, the empire protected from chaos, and all because one man, sitting quietly at the king's gate, had chosen to do what was right rather than what was safe. The entire incident was recorded in the royal chronicles, the official record of the kingdom, including Mordecai's name and his role in uncovering the plot. It seemed like a small thing at the time, just another entry in the vast library of imperial records. But sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the mightiest trees, and this act of quiet heroism would prove to have consequences that no one could have imagined. For now, though, Mordecai simply returned to his place at the king's gate, satisfied that he had done his duty, unaware that his moment of choice between safety and righteousness had just planted seeds that would bloom into salvation for his people, in ways he could never have dreamed. Time in the Persian court moved like a great river, carrying with it the rise and fall of fortunes, the ebb and flow of influence, and the subtle shifts of power that could change the fate of nations. Several years had passed since Esther's coronation, years of relative peace and prosperity, when King Xerxes made a decision that would set in motion events none could foresee. He chose to elevate a man named Haman the Agagite to the position of chief minister, the highest office in the empire save for the king himself. Haman was, by all outward appearances, everything a Persian courtier should be. He was tall and imposing, with the bearing of nobility and the polished manners that marked those born to privilege. His robes were always immaculate, his speech eloquent, and his knowledge of court protocol flawless. When he entered a room, conversations paused, heads turned, and lesser officials scrambled to pay their respects to this man who now stood at the right hand of the king. But beneath the polished exterior, beneath the carefully cultivated image of wisdom and loyalty, Haman carried something darker. He was an Agagite, a descendant of ancient enemies, and in his heart burned resentments that had been passed down through generations like bitter heirlooms. The Agagites had once been kings themselves, rulers of the Amalekites, until they had been defeated, scattered, reduced to subjects in the very empire where their descendants now sought to rebuild their power. The king's decree regarding Haman was clear and absolute, as all royal decrees were. All officials, all servants, all who served in the palace or at the king's gate, were to bow before Haman whenever he passed. It was a mark of the extraordinary honour the king had bestowed upon his new chief minister, a visible symbol of the authority that now rested in Haman's hands. For most of the court, this presented no difficulty. Bowing was simply part of palace protocol, a daily ritual as natural as breathing. But for one man, sitting quietly at the king's gate as he had for so many years, this decree created an impossible conflict. Mordecai, faithful servant of the king, loyal protector of royal secrets, found himself faced with a choice that cut to the very core of who he was. Day after day, as Haman swept through the king's gate in his magnificent robes, surrounded by attendants and radiating authority, every official present would bow, every servant would prostrate themselves, every head would lower in acknowledgement of his power, every head except one. Mordecai alone remained standing, his back straight, his eyes forward, respectful but unbowing. It wasn't pride that kept Mordecai on his feet, nor was it disrespect for Persian authority. He had served the empire faithfully for years, had even saved the king's life, and his loyalty to the crown was beyond question. But deep in his heart, in the place where his faith lived and breathed, he knew that there were some things more important than political expedience, some lines that could not be crossed, even in service to earthly power. The other officials began to notice. Of course, how could they not, in a court where every gesture was observed, every deviation from protocol noted? Mordecai's refusal to bow stood out like a beacon. Some were puzzled, others concerned, and a few, those who knew his background, began to whisper among themselves about the possible reasons for this quiet rebellion. "Why do you disobey the king's command?" they asked him, their voices carrying genuine concern for his welfare. "Surely you know the consequences of defying royal decree." But Mordecai's only response was to remind them quietly that he was a Jew, and that his faith, the very foundation of his being, prevented him from bowing to any man as if that man were divine. Word of this strange behaviour inevitably reached Haman himself, carried by those eager to curry favour with the new chief minister. At first, Haman was merely puzzled, then annoyed, and finally, as the implications became clear, filled with a rage that seemed to consume him from within. This was not mere disobedience. This was a challenge to his authority, a public humiliation that undermined everything he had worked to achieve. But as Haman's anger grew, so did his curiosity about this man who dared to defy him. Who was this Mordecai? What gave him the audacity to remain standing when all others bowed? The answers, when they came, only fed the flames of Haman's fury. Mordecai was a Jew, a member of that scattered people who maintained their strange customs and foreign loyalties, even while living under Persian protection. In Haman's mind, shaped by generations of inherited hatred, this single act of defiance began to grow into something much larger. It wasn't just Mordecai who was the problem, it was all the Jews, with their stubborn refusal to fully assimilate, their insistence on maintaining their distinct identity. their loyalty to a god and a way of life that set them apart from the empire that sheltered them. Night after night, Haman would lie awake in his luxurious chambers, his mind churning with plans and possibilities. A lesser man might have been content to punish Mordecai alone, but Haman's vision was grander, darker, more comprehensive. If the Jews as a people could not be made to bow, then perhaps they should not be allowed to remain at all. The seed of genocide, planted in the fertile soil of wounded pride and ancient hatred, began to grow in Haman's heart, and as it grew, it fed on every slight, every perceived insult, every reminder that his authority, no matter how great, could not compel the deepest loyalties of every heart in the empire. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just Mordecai's faith, not just Esther's courage, but the very soul of an empire that prided itself on tolerance and justice. In his magnificent chambers, surrounded by the trappings of power, Haman began to plot, never suspecting that the very queen who graced the throne beside his king was herself one of those he sought to destroy. The palace scribes called it the month of Nisan, the first month of the Persian calendar, when spring brought new life to gardens and hope to hearts. But in the chambers of Haman, the Agagite, this season of renewal was being twisted into something far darker. His hatred had grown through the long winter months, fed by daily reminders of Mordecai's quiet defiance, until it had become a consuming fire that threatened to engulf not just one man, but an entire people. Haman had spent countless hours in careful calculation, planning, preparing for the moment when he would present his case to the king. He understood the delicate art of persuasion that governed court life, knew that success would depend not just on what he said, but on how he said it, and when. The timing had to be perfect, the king's mood favourable, the circumstances aligned to make his proposal seem not just reasonable, but necessary. On a morning when the spring air carried the scent of blossoming trees, Haman requested an audience with King Xerxes. The king, trusting in his chief minister's wisdom, welcomed him into the private chambers where matters of state were discussed away from the curious eyes and ears of the court. Here, surrounded by the symbols of Persian power, Haman began to weave the web of deception that would nearly destroy a people. "Your Majesty," Haman began, his voice carrying the perfect blend of concern and loyalty that he had perfected over years of court service. "There is a certain people scattered throughout your kingdom, dispersed among all the provinces, whose customs are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, and it is not in your Majesty's interest to tolerate them." The words were carefully chosen, each one calculated to play upon the king's concerns about unity and order within his vast empire. Haman painted the Jews not as the loyal subjects they had proven themselves to be, but as a source of division, a people whose very existence threatened the stability that was the empire's greatest strength. He spoke of their different customs, their strange dietary laws, their refusal to fully assimilate, making it all sound like rebellion wrapped in the clothing of religion. King Xerxes listened, as he always did, trusting in the wisdom of the man he had elevated to such high position. After all, Haman had shown himself to be capable, efficient, loyal in all things. Why would he doubt him now? The king's mind focused on the grand affairs of empire, the tribute flowing in from distant provinces, the military campaigns on far-off borders, could not spare the attention needed to examine Haman's claims carefully. "If it pleases the king," Haman continued, his voice growing more confident as he sensed the king's receptiveness, "let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for those who will carry out this business." The sum was staggering, enough to fund armies, to build cities, to reshape the very landscape of the empire. Where lesser men might have questioned how Haman could afford such a sum, or why he was so eager to spend it, the king heard only the promise of wealth and the solution to what his trusted minister had presented as a problem. Without fully grasping the magnitude of what he was authorizing, King Xerxes removed his signet ring from his finger and handed it to Haman. This ring, bearing the royal seal, carried with it the absolute authority of the Persian throne. Whatever document bore its impression would become law throughout the empire, unchangeable, irrevocable, final as death itself. But Haman's planning went deeper still. He was not content to simply issue a decree. He wanted to choose the perfect moment for its execution, to find a date that would carry the weight of fate itself. And so he turned to an ancient practice, the casting of lots, called pur in the Persian tongue, to determine when this terrible plan would be carried out. Day after day, month after month, the lots were cast, small stones or marked pieces thrown again and again until they spoke, and when they finally settled, they pointed to a date almost a year in the future, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. This delay was not mercy, it was strategy, giving time for the decree to reach every corner of the vast empire, time for preparations to be made, time for the machinery of destruction to be set in motion with methodical efficiency. The decree itself was written in the flowing script of Persian officialdom, translated into every language spoken within the empire's borders, and sent out with the swift efficiency that marked all royal communications. From India to Ethiopia, from the mountains of the north to the deserts of the south, the message spread like poison in the bloodstream of the empire. The words were coldly bureaucratic in their precision, authorizing, commanding, requiring all officials to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in a single day, and to plunder their possessions as reward for their participation in this act of systematic murder. It was genocide disguised as policy, hatred wrapped in the language of law. When the decree reached Susa, when it was proclaimed in the streets where Jewish families had lived peacefully for generations, the effect was like lightning striking a clear sky. Families who had risen that morning in safety, children who had played in familiar courtyards, merchants who had opened their shops with thoughts of daily business, suddenly found themselves marked for death, their lives forfeit to the wounded pride of one man and the careless authority of a king who signed documents without reading their true meaning. In homes throughout the Jewish quarter, mothers gathered their children close, fathers tried to maintain calm while their hearts raced with terror, and the elderly, who remembered other times of persecution, began to pray with the desperate intensity of those who knew that only divine intervention could save them now. The city of Susa itself seemed to pause in confusion. For many Persians had Jewish neighbours, Jewish friends, Jewish colleagues who had proven themselves loyal citizens and valuable members of their communities. How could such people suddenly be declared enemies of the state? How could families who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly be marked for destruction? But the decree bore the royal seal, and in the Persian Empire, the word of the king was law, unchangeable as the movements of the stars, final as the grave. All that remained now was to wait, to count down the months until that terrible 13th day of Adar, when hatred would put on the mask of justice and attempt to write an entire people out of existence. When the decree reached the king's gate, when the words of death were read aloud in the place where Mordecai had served faithfully for so many years, the sound seemed to echo off the ancient stones like a funeral bell. He stood there, this man who had saved a king's life, who had served with integrity and loyalty, listening to his own death sentence being pronounced with the cold efficiency of imperial administration. The weight of understanding fell upon him like a mountain, crushing, overwhelming, final. This wasn't just about him, wasn't just about his refusal to bow to Haman, though he knew that his actions had been the spark that ignited this terrible fire. This was about every Jewish child playing in the courtyards of Susa, every elderly woman lighting Sabbath candles in humble homes, every young man trying to build a life in this foreign land that had become home. Mordecai's legs felt weak beneath him, but he managed to walk, to move through the streets that had become so familiar over the years of his residence in Susa. Each step took him further from the palace, further from the world of carefully modulated voices and diplomatic protocol, and closer to a grief so vast that it seemed to swallow the very sky. He went to his house first, the same modest dwelling where he had raised young Hadassah, where they had shared quiet evenings and gentle conversations about faith and hope and the mysterious ways of the Almighty. But now the walls that had once sheltered love seemed to close in around him, and he knew he could not contain this sorrow within any earthly structure, with hands that shook despite his efforts to steady them. Mordecai removed his normal clothes, the neat garments that had marked him as a respectable official of the Persian court. In their place, he clothed himself in sackcloth, the rough, uncomfortable fabric that his people had worn for generations to mark times of mourning and repentance. Over his head, over his carefully groomed hair and beard, he poured ashes, the grey dust that spoke of destruction, of dreams turned to cinders, of hopes reduced to nothing. Then, dressed as a mourner for his own people, Mordecai returned to the streets of Susa, but he didn't walk quietly now, didn't maintain the careful dignity that had marked his years of service. Instead, he lifted his voice in a cry that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, a wail of anguish that carried across the marketplace, through the residential quarters, up toward the very walls of the palace itself. It was a sound that made people stop what they were doing, made mothers gather their children closer, made merchants pause in their bargaining to listen with growing unease, for this wasn't the voice of a single man in private grief. This was the sound of a people facing extinction, the cry of a community that had been marked for death by the stroke of a pen. Other Jews, hearing Mordecai's lament, began to emerge from their homes. Some joined their voices to his, adding their tears to the river of sorrow that seemed to flow through the streets. Others simply stood in their doorways, too shocked to move, too overwhelmed to speak, watching as their world crumbled around them like a sandcastle struck by an unexpected wave. Word of the unusual disturbance in the city reached the palace quickly, as all news did in that place where information was currency and knowledge was power. The servants whispered among themselves. The guards exchanged meaningful glances, and eventually, inevitably, the news reached the ears of Queen Esther herself. She was in her chambers, surrounded by the silks and jewels that marked her elevated station, when her closest attendant, a young woman named Hatash, approached with the puzzling news. A man was wailing in the streets, they said, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, crying out in a voice that carried across the city like the sound of thunder. "Find out who this man is," Esther instructed, though something in her heart already whispered the answer she feared to hear. "Learn what has caused this great distress." And so Hatash, faithful in service as all the queen's attendants were, went out into the city to investigate. When he returned, his face was pale with the gravity of what he had discovered. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice careful and low, "the man is Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate. He mourns because of a decree that has gone out, a decree commanding the destruction of all Jews throughout the empire." The words hit Esther like a physical blow, stealing her breath, making her legs weak beneath her. Mordecai, her beloved cousin, her protector, her guide through all the uncertain years of childhood and youth, was marked for death. Not just him, but all her people, everyone who shared the faith that had shaped her heart, the traditions that had given meaning to her life before she became queen. Her first instinct was to help him, to send clothes so he could remove the sackcloth and enter the palace, so they could speak face to face about this crisis. But when Hatash returned with her gifts, Mordecai refused them. His mourning was not something to be set aside for convenience. His grief was not a garment to be changed at will. He would not be comforted, would not be silenced, until this decree of death was somehow overturned. Instead, he sent back a message that struck at the very foundations of Esther's world. Through Hatash, he told her exactly what Haman had done, how he had manipulated the king, how the lots had been cast, how the date had been set for the destruction of their people. And then, most terrifying of all, he asked her to do something that could cost her everything. "Go to the king," his message said, carried by faithful Hatash through the carefully guarded corridors of power. "Plead with him for your people. Appeal to him for mercy." The words seemed simple enough, but Esther knew better. She understood. as Mordecai surely did, that what he was asking was virtually impossible. For 30 days, she had not been summoned to the king's presence. 30 days since she had seen his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his attention focused upon her. And Persian law was absolute in this matter. Anyone who approached the king in his inner court without being summoned, anyone who dared to enter his presence uninvited, would be put to death. The only exception, the only hope for survival, was if the king extended his golden scepter, a gesture of mercy that might or might not come. The choice before her was stark, terrible, impossible. She could remain silent, could protect her own life while her people died, could preserve her position while her heritage was erased from the earth, or she could risk everything, could step into the king's presence uninvited, could gamble her life on the hope that love and mercy might triumph over protocol and law. As night fell over the palace, as the lamps were lit in chambers throughout the vast complex, Queen Esther sat alone with the weight of decision pressing down upon her like the darkness itself. Outside her windows, in the city below, Mordecai continued his vigil, his voice carrying across the starlit air, a reminder that time was running out, and that sometimes the choice between safety and righteousness is the choice that defines not just a life, but a legacy. Queen Esther sat in her chambers through the long hours of that terrible night, her heart heavy with the weight of impossible choices. The silk cushions that had once brought comfort now felt foreign beneath her. The golden walls that had once seemed welcoming now felt like the walls of a beautiful prison. Through her windows, she could still hear the distant sound of mourning from the city below, Mordecai's voice joining with others in a lament that seemed to rise toward heaven itself. When morning came, pale and uncertain through the latticed windows, Esther made her decision. She would not, could not, remain silent while her people faced destruction. But neither could she simply rush headlong into the king's presence without understanding fully what Mordecai was asking of her. And so, with trembling hands, she composed a message to be carried back to him by faithful Hattar. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know. Her message began, each word carefully chosen, each phrase weighted with the gravity of their situation, that any man or woman who goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death. The only exception is if the king holds out the golden scepter, that they may live. But I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. The message was clear, honest, desperate. She was not refusing Mordecai's request, but she was making sure he understood the full magnitude of what he was asking. This was not merely a matter of swallowing her pride or facing embarrassment. This was about walking deliberately toward what was almost certainly death, gambling everything on the slim hope that the king's love for her might overcome centuries of Persian law. When Hattar returned from delivering this message, he carried with him words that would echo through history, words that would be remembered long after the Persian Empire had crumbled to dust, long after the very stones of Susa had been scattered by time and weather. Mordecai's response was not gentle, not comforting, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. Do not think to yourself. Mordecai's message began, his words cutting through Esther's royal isolation like a sword through silk, that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. The words struck Esther like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the illusions that had sustained her through the comfortable years of her reign. Her position, her palace, her very crown. None of these could protect her from the decree that marked her for death. She was a Jew, no matter how well she had hidden that identity, no matter how perfectly she had played the role of Persian queen. And when the 13th day of Adar came, Her true heritage would be revealed in the most terrible way possible. But then came the words that would change everything. The phrase that would transform a frightened young woman into one of history's greatest heroes. Words that seemed to shimmer with divine purpose even as they were carried through the mundane corridors of palace communication. And who knows? Mordecai continued, his message reaching across the gap between them with the power of prophecy itself. Whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. For such a time as this. The words seemed to hang in the air of Esther's chambers like incense, filling every corner with their significance. All her life, every step of her journey, from the modest house in the Jewish quarter to the orphaned childhood, from the year of preparation to the night she won the king's heart, from the quiet months of learning to be queen to this moment of ultimate testing. All of it had been preparation for this choice, this moment, this crisis. She thought of her parents, dead too soon, leaving her in Mordecai's care. She thought of the strange circumstances that had brought her to the palace, the beauty contests she had never sought, the crown she had never imagined wearing. She thought of the coincidences, if they were coincidences, that had placed her in this position of influence at precisely the moment when her people needed someone with access to the king's ear. Perhaps none of it had been chance at all. Perhaps every seemingly random event, every twist of fate, every moment of preparation, had been orchestrated by a wisdom far greater than any human planning. Perhaps she had been chosen, prepared, placed, for exactly this purpose, to stand between her people and destruction, to risk everything in the hope of saving everyone. The realization came over her like sunrise after the darkest night, bringing not comfort exactly, but something deeper, something stronger, purpose, clarity, the terrifying but liberating knowledge that some moments in life are too important for safety, too significant for self-preservation, too crucial for anything but absolute courage. Slowly, with hands that had stopped trembling, Esther reached for her writing materials. The message she composed was brief, but it carried within it the weight of absolute resolution, the quiet power of a decision made not in passion but in the deepest conviction of her heart. "Go," she wrote to Mordecai, each word a step further away from the safe path she had been travelling, each phrase a bridge burned behind her. "Gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." 5 words that contained within them the essence of true courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite fear, not the certainty of success, but the acceptance that some things are worth dying for, some causes greater than any individual life, some moments that demand everything we have to give. As the message was carried away, as faithful Hathach disappeared once more into the corridors that connected palace to city, Esther felt something shift within her heart. The frightened girl was not gone, would never be entirely gone, but she was no longer in control. What rose to take her place was a queen in the truest sense, not because of any crown or title, but because she had chosen to accept responsibility for something larger than herself. 3 days of fasting lay ahead, 3 days of prayer and preparation, 3 days to gather her courage for the most important walk of her life. But the decision was made, the course was set, and Queen Esther, once the orphaned Hadassah, once the frightened girl brought to the palace against her will, was ready to discover what it truly meant to be chosen for such a time as this. When Mordecai received Esther's message, when he read those final words, "If I perish, I perish," he felt something shift in his heart, a mixture of pride and terror that took his breath away. The little girl he had raised, the gentle young woman he had watched grow in wisdom and grace, had become someone he hardly recognized, someone whose courage humbled him even as it filled him with fear for her safety. Without delay, he began the work Esther had requested. Throughout the Jewish quarter of Susa, the words spread like ripples on still water, carried by whispered conversations, by meaningful glances, by the kind of urgent communication that moves through communities when survival itself hangs in the balance. The queen, their queen, though few knew of her true identity, was preparing to risk everything for their sake, and she had asked for their support in the only way that mattered, through prayer, through fasting, through the kind of spiritual preparation that had sustained their people through every crisis. By sunset of that first day, a remarkable thing had happened. In homes throughout the city, Jewish families had set aside their evening meals, had gathered their children close, and had begun to pray with an intensity born of desperation and hope in equal measure. Old women who had not missed a meal in years sat beside their empty tables, their gnarled hands folded in supplication. Young fathers who worked hard for every morsel of bread chose hunger over helplessness, offering their physical comfort as a sacrifice for their people's survival. In the palace, Esther had dismissed her usual attendants, keeping only those she trusted most completely. Her chambers, normally filled with the sounds of preparation, of jewellery being arranged, of garments being selected, had fallen into an unusual quiet. The golden plates that usually bore delicacies from across the empire sat empty. The wine cups that normally sparkled with the finest vintages remained untouched. And the queen herself, dressed in simple robes rather than royal finery, knelt on the marble floor in prayer. The first day of fasting was the hardest, as first days always are. Esther's body, accustomed to regular meals, to the rich foods of the royal table, protested against this sudden deprivation. Her stomach cramped, her head ached, and a terrible restlessness seemed to fill her bones. But as the discomfort grew, so did something else, a clarity, a sharpening of purpose that came when physical needs were set aside for spiritual focus. Throughout the city, the Jewish community was experiencing something similar. Children who had never missed a meal before learned what it meant to choose principle over comfort. Mothers who had spent their days preparing food instead spent them in quiet contemplation, their hands busy with prayer rather than cooking. Merchants who usually rose early to prepare their wares instead rose to lift their voices in supplication, their usual concerns forgotten in the face of ultimate need. By the second day, something remarkable was happening. The hunger that had seemed so overwhelming on the first day had settled into a different kind of awareness, a heightened sensitivity to things that usually went unnoticed. Esther found herself hearing sounds she had never paid attention to before. The whisper of wind through the palace gardens, the distant call of birds, the soft footsteps of servants in corridors far away. It was as if fasting had stripped away not just physical comfort, but the usual distractions that kept the heart from attending to deeper truths. In her prayers, Esther found herself remembering things she had almost forgotten, stories Mordecai had told her in their quiet evenings, tales of ancestors who had faced impossible odds with nothing but faith as their weapon. She remembered Sarah, laughing at the promise of a child in her old age, Abraham, willing to sacrifice his beloved son in obedience to a call he couldn't fully understand, Moses, standing before Pharaoh with nothing but a staff and the word of the Almighty, David, facing Goliath with only a sling and the certainty that right was stronger than might. Each story seemed to speak directly to her situation, to whisper encouragement across the centuries, to remind her that ordinary people, frightened people, uncertain people, had found extraordinary courage when it was needed most. She was not the first to face overwhelming odds, not the first to stand between her people and destruction, not the first to discover that sometimes love requires everything we have to give. The second night brought dreams, strange, vivid, filled with symbols she couldn't quite interpret but somehow understood. She saw herself standing in a vast throne room, not the familiar chamber where King Xerxes held court, but something grander, more terrible, more beautiful. She saw a scepter extended, not golden but blazing with light. and felt a presence that was both welcoming and awesome beyond description. On the third day, the fast was no longer a burden but had become something else entirely, a doorway into a deeper kind of strength. Esther's hunger had transformed into something that felt almost like nourishment, as if her spirit was being fed even as her body was deprived. Her prayers had evolved from desperate pleading into something closer to conversation, a quiet communion with the one who held all hearts, all kingdoms, all futures in hands too large for human understanding. Throughout Susa, the Jewish community had undergone a similar transformation. The initial desperation had given way to a kind of peace, not the peace of certainty about outcomes, but the peace that comes from knowing you have done everything possible, from understanding that some battles are fought not with swords, but with surrender, not with force, but with faith. By the evening of the third day, as the sun set over the palace walls and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Esther felt ready. Not confident. Confidence seemed too small a word for what lay ahead, but prepared in ways that had nothing to do with strategy or planning. She had been stripped down to her essence, refined by deprivation, purified by prayer, and what remained was not the frightened girl who had entered the palace, not even the gracious queen who had learned to navigate court politics, but something new, something stronger, someone who had learned to trust in wisdom greater than her own. Tomorrow, she would dress in her royal robes, would arrange her hair in the style that pleased the king, would paint her eyes and perfume her skin as court protocol demanded. But tonight, kneeling on the marble floor of her chambers, surrounded by the prayers of her people rising like incense toward heaven, she was simply Hadassah, the myrtle, rooted in faith, ready to bloom even in the face of death, prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. The 3 days of fasting were ending, but their purpose had been accomplished. A community had been united in purpose, a people had been prepared for whatever was to come, and a young woman had discovered that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk forward when fear would counsel retreat, to choose love when hatred seems stronger, to risk everything when everything is at stake. The morning of the 4th day dawned clear and bright, as if the very heavens were holding their breath for what was to come. Esther woke not from sleep, for sleep had been elusive during these 3 days of fasting and prayer, but from a deep state of quiet contemplation that had sustained her through the long night hours. Outside her windows, the palace gardens were beginning to stir with the gentle sounds of morning, birds calling from hidden perches, the whisper of wind through cypress trees, the distant murmur of servants beginning their daily tasks. But inside the queen's chambers, time seemed suspended, as if this moment existed outside the normal flow of hours and minutes. Esther's attendants, those few who had shared her vigil, moved with unusual quiet as they began the careful process of transformation. For today, perhaps more than any other day in her life, Esther needed to look every inch the queen, needed to embody the grace and beauty that had first captured the king's heart, needed to be irresistible in ways that might mean the difference between life and death. The royal robes were brought forth, garments of such exquisite beauty that they seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. The fabric was silk, dyed the deep purple that was reserved for royalty, woven with threads of gold that caught and reflected every ray of sunlight. As the robes settled around her, Esther felt their weight, not just the physical weight of precious fabric and metalwork, but the symbolic weight of authority, of position, of the responsibility that came with wearing the crown of Persia. Her hair was arranged with painstaking care, each curl placed precisely, each ornament positioned to catch the light in exactly the right way. Golden combs held everything in place, their surfaces studded with gems that sparkled like captured stars. Around her neck, the royal jewels settled with familiar weight, sapphires and emeralds and pearls that had been gifts from the king himself. Each one a token of his affection, each one now a desperate hope that such affection might extend to mercy. The final touch was the crown itself, the delicate circlet of gold and precious stones that marked her as queen of the greatest empire the world had ever known. As it settled onto her head, Esther caught sight of herself in the polished bronze mirror, and for a moment, she hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. 3 days of fasting had refined her features, had given her an almost ethereal beauty, but more than that, there was something in her eyes, a depth, a resolve that had not been there before. When the preparation was complete, when every detail had been attended to with the precision that court life demanded, Esther dismissed her attendants. What lay ahead was something she had to face alone, a walk that would define not just her own fate, but the fate of an entire people. She stood for a moment in the silence of her chambers, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak. The corridors of the palace seemed different as she walked through them, longer somehow, more echoing, as if the very stones were aware of the significance of her passage. Guards snapped to attention as she passed, their faces showing the respect due to royalty, but also, in the eyes of those who knew her well, a flicker of concern. It was unusual for the Queen to walk the palace halls unescorted. Stranger still for her to be moving toward the King's private quarters when no summons had been issued. With each step, Esther felt her heart beating against the constraints of her royal robes, a steady rhythm that seemed to count down the moments until her fate would be decided. The throne room, when she finally reached it, loomed before her like a judgment hall, its great doors standing slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the golden magnificence within. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the cool marble of the doorframe, and offered one final prayer, not for success, not for safety, but for the strength to accept whatever came next with grace. Then, drawing herself up to her full height, letting the regal bearing that had been drilled into her over years of palace life take control, she stepped across the boundary between the outer corridors and the sacred space where only the king's closest advisors were permitted to enter uninvited. The inner court was magnificent, as it always was, but today it seemed to glow with an almost supernatural light. The great pillars soared upward toward a ceiling painted with scenes of Persian glory, their surfaces polished until they reflected like dark mirrors. Tapestries hung between the columns, their rich colours telling stories of conquest and triumph, while braziers filled the air with the scent of precious incense. And there, at the heart of it all, on the golden throne that had been the seat of Persian power for generations, sat King Xerxes. He was reviewing scrolls with several advisors, his attention focused on the business of empire, his profile serious as he considered matters of state. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the gold threads in his robes, made his crown seem to blaze with captured fire, and reminded anyone who saw him why men called him the King of Kings. For a moment that felt like eternity. Esther stood in the entrance to the inner court, visible to anyone who might glance in her direction, but not yet noticed by the king himself. This was the moment of ultimate vulnerability, when she was committed to her course but not yet protected by royal mercy, when she had broken the law but had not yet discovered whether love might prove stronger than legal precedent. Then, as if sensing her presence, King Xerxes looked up from his scrolls. His eyes found her immediately, and for a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. His expression was unreadable. She saw surprise there, and concern, and something that might have been fear at this unprecedented breach of protocol. The advisors, following the king's gaze, fell silent as they too became aware of the queen's forbidden presence. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility, dangerous with uncertainty. Esther remained perfectly still, her training in court etiquette holding her in place even as her heart raced with the implications of what she had done. Everything now depended on the king's response, on whether the man she had married would choose law or love, whether the ruler of Persia would see in her desperate presence a challenge to his authority or a plea from his beloved queen. And then, slowly, deliberately, with a gesture that would be remembered for as long as the story of courage was told, King Xerxes raised his hand. In it, gleaming like hope itself, was the golden scepter, the symbol of royal favour, the token of life extended to one who had risked everything on the uncertain mercy of love. The scepter stretched toward her across the space that separated them, across the gulf between fear and safety, across the chasm between death and life. And Queen Esther, her heart flooding with relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees, stepped forward to touch the golden symbol of grace, knowing that her gamble had succeeded, that her people had been given a chance, that sometimes, just sometimes, love really is stronger than law. The golden scepter was warm beneath Esther's fingertips, warm with the promise of life, of mercy, of a love that had proven stronger than the most ancient laws of the empire. As she touched its polished surface, she felt the terrible tension that had held her rigid for 3 days finally begin to ease, though she knew, with the wisdom that comes from walking through fire, that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. King Xerxes' voice, when he spoke, carried all the warmth she remembered from their private moments, all the affection that had first drawn him to choose her above all others. "What is it, Queen Esther?" he asked, his tone gentle despite the breach of protocol she had just committed, his eyes searching her face for some understanding of what could have driven her to such desperate measures. "What is your request?" "It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Half of my kingdom. The traditional promise of Persian royalty, generous beyond measure, spoken in the presence of witnesses who would remember every word. But Esther, standing there in her magnificent robes with the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders, knew that what she needed to ask for was far more valuable than any portion of worldly wealth, and far more dangerous to request. The advisors who had been conferring with the king watched this exchange with barely concealed fascination. Court protocol had been shattered, yet somehow the king seemed more pleased than angry, more curious than offended. They sensed that they were witnessing something significant, though none could guess the true magnitude of what was unfolding before their eyes. But Esther, even in her relief at being spared immediate death, even in the joy of seeing love triumph over law, had not forgotten the lessons of her long preparation for queenship. Timing, she had learned, was everything in the delicate dance of palace politics. The wrong word at the wrong moment could destroy even the most carefully laid plans, while patience, properly applied, could turn impossible situations into opportunities. "If it pleases the king," she began, her voice carrying the musical quality that had always charmed him, her words chosen with the same care that a jeweller might use in setting precious stones. "Let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him." The request was simple, elegant, unexpected, not a plea for legislation or intervention, not a dramatic revelation of crisis, just an invitation to share a meal, to enjoy the kind of intimate gathering that the king had always treasured. The invitation intrigued Xerxes immediately. Esther's banquets were legendary throughout the palace, affairs of exquisite taste and refined pleasure that demonstrated why she had become not just his queen but his closest companion. To be invited to such an occasion, especially after the mysterious circumstances of her uninvited approach, promised an evening of both culinary delight and perhaps illumination about whatever had driven her to such unprecedented action. "Bring Haman quickly," the king commanded his servants, his enthusiasm evident in the promptness of his response. "So that we may do as Esther has said." The choice to include Haman was significant, though the king could not know how significant. In his mind, it was simply courteous to include his chief minister in any royal entertainment, a gesture of respect for the man who had proven himself so capable in the administration of the empire. Word of the royal banquet spread through the palace with the speed that marked all significant news in a place where information was currency and access was power. Servants hurried to prepare, cooks began their careful orchestrations. And in his own chambers, Haman received the invitation with a satisfaction that bordered on triumph, to be included in an intimate royal banquet, to be chosen as one of only 3 people worthy of the queen's personal attention, This was recognition of his importance that even exceeded his recent elevation to chief minister. As the afternoon wore on, as preparations proceeded with the efficiency that marked all palace operations, Esther retreated to her chambers to prepare herself for the evening ahead. But this preparation was different from the morning's careful attention to royal appearance. This was the preparation of a strategist, a woman who had learned that true power lay not in demanding what you needed, but in creating circumstances where others would want to give it to you. The banquet hall chosen for the evening was one of the smaller chambers, intimate rather than overwhelming, designed to facilitate conversation rather than to impress with scale. Here, surrounded by silk hangings and soft lamplight, with the scent of jasmine drifting through latticed windows, the three most powerful people in the Persian Empire would share food and wine, while beneath the surface of courtesy and celebration, forces were gathering that would reshape the fate of nations. When evening came, when the king and Haman arrived in their finest robes, when the first courses were served on plates of gold and silver, Esther played her role to perfection. She was the gracious hostess, the charming companion, the queen whose presence made even the most ordinary moments feel touched with magic. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, covering topics of art and philosophy, court gossip and distant provinces, everything except the crisis that had driven her to risk her life that very morning. Haman, seated at the right hand of power, basked in the recognition that this invitation represented. Here he was, a man who had risen from relative obscurity to the highest positions in the empire, sharing intimate conversation with the king and queen, treated as an equal by the very pinnacles of Persian society. His earlier concerns about Mordecai's defiance seemed petty and distant, overwhelmed by this evidence of his own success and acceptance. As the evening progressed, as the wine warmed hearts and loosened tongues, King Xerxes again asked the question that had been haunting him since morning. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." This was the moment, the opening Esther had been waiting for, the chance to make her real request before an audience that included the very man whose plot had driven her to such desperate measures. But even now, even with the king's promise ringing in the air, even with Haman sitting unsuspecting beside them, she chose patience over precipitous action. "My petition and my request is," she began, her voice carrying just the right note of gracious uncertainty, of a woman who understood the magnitude of what she was asking. "If I have found favour in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Another invitation, another delay, another evening of anticipation and preparation. The king agreed immediately, charmed by the prospect of a second such delightful occasion, while Haman practically glowed with the recognition that he was being included again, that his position in the royal favour was so secure that he had become an essential part of the royal social circle. As the evening wound to its close, as farewells were exchanged and the royal party departed, Esther stood alone in the empty banquet hall, surrounded by the remnants of fine food and elegant conversation, knowing that she had chosen her course wisely. Tomorrow, at the second banquet, with trust established and wine flowing and the king's promise renewed, she would finally speak the words that could save her people or seal her own doom. But tonight, she had bought time, had deepened relationships, had positioned herself perfectly for the moment when truth would finally be spoken and justice would have its chance to triumph over hatred. The first banquet was over, but its real purpose had been accomplished, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether love or hate, whether justice or revenge, would write the final chapter of this ancient story. The second evening arrived wrapped in anticipation, as if the very air around the palace had become charged with the weight of unspoken truths waiting to be born. Esther spent the day in careful preparation, not just of the banquet itself, though every detail had been attended to with meticulous care, but of her own heart, her own courage, her own readiness to speak words that could not be taken back once they were released into the world. When King Xerxes and Haman arrived for the second banquet, the atmosphere was even more relaxed than it had been the evening before. Familiarity had bred comfort, trust had been established, and both men arrived expecting another evening of refined pleasure and elegant conversation. The king, pleased by the previous night's entertainment, looked forward to whatever surprise his clever queen might have prepared. Haman, still glowing with the recognition of being included in such intimate royal company, felt his position in the empire had never been more secure. The banquet hall glowed with warm lamplight, the tables laden with delicacies prepared by the finest cooks in the empire, the air perfumed with subtle incenses that spoke of luxury and leisure. Wine flowed freely, as it had the night before, and conversation moved from topic to topic with the easy grace of friends sharing confidences. But beneath the surface tranquility, Esther's heart beat with the rhythm of approaching revelation, the knowledge that before this evening ended, masks would fall, truths would be spoken, and destinies would be forever altered. As the evening progressed, as the wine warmed hearts and the atmosphere grew ever more convivial, King Xerxes once again posed the question that had haunted him through 2 days of curiosity and growing concern. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." For the third time, the traditional promise was offered, generous beyond measure, spoken now not just as royal courtesy, but with the genuine warmth of a husband concerned for his beloved wife's welfare. The king's voice carried real affection, real willingness to grant whatever boon she might request, real love that had proven itself stronger than ancient protocol. This was the moment, the opening Esther had been waiting for, the chance she had purchased with patience and strategy, the opportunity that had cost her 3 days of fasting and a lifetime of fear. She looked across the table at these 2 men, her husband whom she loved, and the man whose hatred had marked her people for destruction, and found within herself the strength that had been growing through all the quiet years of preparation. "If I have found favour in your sight, O king," she began, her voice carrying a new quality, a depth of emotion that had not been present in their previous conversations. "And if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." The words hung in the perfumed air like a thunderclap, transforming the intimate atmosphere of the banquet into something far more serious, far more dangerous. My life. My people. Suddenly, this was no longer a social gathering, but a court of appeal. No longer an evening of entertainment, but a moment when justice itself stood trial. King Xerxes felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of her words began to penetrate his wine-warmed consciousness. Esther's life was in danger. Her people, whoever they were, faced some threat that required royal intervention. His mind raced back through recent decisions, recent policies, trying to understand what crisis could have driven his beloved queen to such desperate measures. "For we have been sold," Esther continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, each phrase stripping away another layer of the careful disguise she had maintained for so many years. "I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction would not have been worth troubling the king." The revelation struck the room like lightning striking a clear sky. Esther, his beloved Esther, was not the Persian noblewoman he had believed her to be. She was... The understanding came slowly, terrifyingly, inevitably. She was a Jew, his queen, the woman he had chosen above all others, the companion of his heart and partner of his throne, belonged to the very people whom his chief minister had convinced him to destroy. Haman, seated beside the king, felt his own blood turn to ice as the meaning of Esther's words became clear. The queen, whose banquets had flattered his ego, whose invitations had seemed to confirm his unassailable position, was one of them, one of the people whose destruction he had orchestrated, whose death he had purchased with promises of silver, whose annihilation he had scheduled for the 13th day of Adar. "Who is he? And where is he?" King Xerxes demanded, his voice shaking with a rage that seemed to fill the room with electricity. "Who has dared to do this?" The question was asked with the terrible authority of absolute power, the fury of a man who had discovered that someone close enough to influence royal policy, had dared to plot against the life of his beloved queen. Esther's answer came without hesitation, clear and direct as the blade of a sword cutting through deception, final as the judgment of heaven itself. A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. The accusation exploded in the banquet hall like a thunderbolt, shattering the careful facades that had governed court life, revealing truths that had been hidden beneath layers of protocol and political manipulation. Haman, the king's trusted advisor, the man who had been elevated to the highest position in the empire, sat frozen with terror as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him like a house built on sand. King Xerxes rose from his seat, his movement so sudden and violent that it sent goblets and plates crashing to the floor, his face terrible with the kind of rage that topples kingdoms and rewrites history. Without a word, he strode from the banquet hall into the palace garden, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he had just learned, his heart torn between fury at the deception and anguish at the danger his beloved queen had faced. Alone with Esther, Haman fell before her in desperation, his arrogance transformed instantly into pleading, his confidence dissolved into the raw terror of a man who had suddenly discovered that he had been playing with forces far beyond his control. He threw himself upon the couch where she reclined, begging for mercy, grasping for any hope of survival in the wreckage of his ambitions. It was there, in that posture of desperate supplication, that King Xerxes found him when he returned from the garden, his rage now cold and settled into the terrible certainty of justice. "Will he even assault the queen in my presence? In my own house?" the king demanded, his voice carrying the finality of divine judgment. The end came swiftly, as ends always do when truth finally emerges from the shadows where it has been hiding. Haman was led away to face the very fate he had prepared for Mordecai, the gallows he had built in his arrogance becoming the instrument of his own destruction. Justice completing its circle with the precision that marks all divine intervention in human affairs. But even as Haman's story ended, even as the immediate threat to her life was removed, Esther knew that her real work was just beginning. A decree had been issued, sealed with the royal seal, marked with the authority of Persian law. Her people were still marked for destruction, still facing annihilation on the 13th day of Adar, still in need of a salvation that only she was positioned to provide. The revelation had been made, the villain exposed, the queen's courage vindicated. But the story of Esther's triumph, the full flowering of her courage in silence, was yet to be completed. In the days that followed Haman's downfall, as news of his execution spread through the palace and beyond, a strange quiet settled over the empire. The kind of stillness that comes after a great storm has passed, leaving behind a world forever changed by the forces that have swept through it. King Xerxes, sobered by how close he had come to destroying the woman he loved, moved quickly to repair what damage could be repaired, to heal what wounds could be healed, to set right what had been so terribly wrong. Mordecai, the man whose quiet courage had saved a king's life and whose steadfast faith had refused to bow before hatred, was summoned to the palace and elevated to the position that Haman had vacated. The irony was profound. The man whom Haman had sought to destroy now wore his robes, carried his authority, and wielded the very power that had been intended for evil toward the service of justice and protection. But even with Haman gone, even with Mordecai elevated, even with the king's favour now clearly bestowed upon the Jewish people, the most pressing crisis remained unresolved. Persian law was inflexible in this regard. A decree sealed with the royal seal could not be revoked, could not be changed, could not be undone by any earthly power. The 13th day of Adar still loomed ahead, and throughout the empire, the machinery of destruction that Haman had set in motion continued to grind forward with terrible inevitability. It was Esther, wise in the ways she had learned through trial and preparation, who suggested the solution that would save her people without violating the sacred traditions of Persian law. If the original decree could not be rescinded, then let a new decree be issued, one that would give the Jewish people the right to defend themselves, to organize, to fight back against those who would seek to carry out Haman's murderous plan. The new decree, when it was written, bore the same authority as the first, sealed with the same royal seal, distributed with the same efficiency that marked all Persian administration, but its message was entirely different, entirely hopeful, entirely just. On the 13th day of Adar, the Jews throughout the empire would have the right to gather together, to defend their lives, to strike back at their enemies, and to take the plunder of those who had planned their destruction. When this new decree reached the Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the effect was like sunrise after the longest night. In Susa, in the very streets where Mordecai had walked in sackcloth and ashes, celebration replaced mourning, joy displaced fear, and hope bloomed where despair had taken root. The people who had been marked for death were now empowered to defend themselves. The scattered community that had seemed so vulnerable was now united in purpose and protected by royal authority. The 13th day of Adar, when it finally arrived, became not a day of destruction, but a day of vindication. Not a day of mourning, but a day of triumph. Throughout the empire, the Jewish people defended themselves with the courage of those who fight not just for their own lives, but for their children's future and their enemies, discovering that their intended victims were prepared and protected, found themselves facing the very fate they had planned to inflict on others. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of that day was its restraint, its mercy even in the moment of victory, while the decree had given the Jews the right to take plunder from their defeated enemies. They chose not to exercise that right, choosing instead to be content with their survival, with their safety, with the knowledge that justice had been served without descending to the level of their oppressors. From that day forward, the 14th and 15th days of Adar became days of celebration throughout the Jewish world, feast days called Purim after the lots that Haman had cast to choose the date of destruction, annual reminders of how quickly despair can turn to joy, how completely hatred can be defeated by love, how miraculously ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary salvation. Queen Esther's role in these events was never forgotten, though she herself seemed to prefer the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled to the more public celebrations of heroism recognized. She continued to reign beside King Xerxes with the same grace and wisdom that had first attracted his attention, but now with an added depth, a seasoning of character that comes only to those who have faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. In the years that followed, as the story of her courage spread throughout the empire and beyond, Esther became more than just a queen. She became a symbol of what is possible when ordinary people choose to trust in extraordinary purposes, when quiet faith proves stronger than loud hatred, when love demonstrates its ultimate triumph over fear. Her legacy lived on in the festivals celebrated annually, in the stories told to children generation after generation, in the reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords, but with patience, not with force, but with faith, not with public demonstrations, but with private courage that chooses to act when action seems impossible. And perhaps most importantly, her story became a reminder that we are all, in our own ways, chosen for such times as these, that every generation faces moments when ordinary people must choose between safety and service, between comfort and courage, between remaining silent and speaking truth, even when that truth might cost us everything we hold dear. Tonight, as we come to the end of Esther's story, as we prepare to return from ancient Persia to our own time and place, we carry with us the knowledge that her courage was not superhuman, was not the product of some special strength denied to the rest of us, but was simply the natural result of a life lived in faithfulness, of a heart prepared through prayer, of a spirit willing to trust that love is stronger than hatred, that justice is more powerful than revenge, that hope is always, always worth the risk. The young girl named Hadassah, who grew up in a modest house in Susa, who learned to trust in purposes larger than her own understanding, who discovered that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply remain present when everything in you wants to flee, became Queen Esther, whose courage in silence changed the course of history, and whose legacy reminds us still that we too, each of us, are chosen for such a time as this. Sleep now, gentle listener, and dream of courage that blooms in quiet places, of love that proves stronger than law, of ordinary people who discover that they are capable of extraordinary things when they choose faith over fear, hope over despair, and action over silence, even when the cost seems greater than they can bear. For such a time as this, such a time as this, such a time as this.